Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I guess we should get started. Thank you all for coming to this part 2 of the annual renewal tenure promotion workshops that are conducted jointly by the university and QUFA to help the RTP committees and also the heads of departments to find your way through the tortuous RTP process as set out in the collective agreement. I'm John Dixon. I'm the now called the Vice Provost International, formerly Associate VP Academic, which is why I'm doing this. And joining me at the front desk are, to my immediate right, Phil Goldman, the QUFA Grievance Officer, Constance Adamson, the co-chair of the JCAA from the QUFA side, and what's your name? Dan Bradshaw. Sorry, from the Faculty Relations. Dan is the Associate VP Faculty Relations in the Office of the Provost. So as I said, this is part 2. We had a part 1 in June. Could I ask how many of you actually were present for the part 1 this year? Okay, so about half. That's good. So as we are doing now, at the June session, we videotaped the proceedings, and the videotape from June is up on the Faculty Relations website, so you can go there if you had any questions about the first half of this process. And after today, you'll be able to go to the website. I don't know how long it takes to get the video up. Is it a couple of weeks? Yeah. Okay. So shortly, you'll be able to review this session as well. And the videographer will be focusing on the people at the front who are speaking, and so you don't need to worry about your own face appearing on the video. We will be hoping to pick up the sound of questions, though. So I would ask that when you ask a question, please try to project so that the microphone, which is on the camera, will pick you up. If we think your question was a little soft, I'll try to repeat the question so that everyone can hear it, and so it'll be picked up on the mic. Okay, so you have in front of you a handout, which is the Pepto-Bismol pink one, which is a table of which is intended to help you through the RTP process. It's basically a broken down step-by-step listing of all of the stages and issues that need to be considered while you're running through the process. And there's also a column in the middle called Item Complete that has a number of boxes in it. I've kind of skipped from the very first part. Sorry, I probably should start right at the beginning. The first page just simply lists some relevant articles that people on the RTP committees should be familiar with and should review. We went over that in some detail in the June session, so I won't do it in detail now. But I'd ask you to read through the general section at the beginning, the first 2 pages. Page 3 is a kind of a guide to what's in the rest of the document. And the document is divided into 5 tables. Tables 1, 2, and 3 were the first stages of the process up to the point where the RTP file is ready to be reviewed by the committee, and that was the subject of our spring workshop. And today's session is intended to focus on the recommendation process, both at the committee level and at the head level, and then it touches briefly on what happens at the dean level and the principal level as well. So we're going to deal primarily with table 4 in this document, and if you could turn to table 4, maybe that's a good place to start. It's on page 8. I should also mention that the faculty processes, that is renewal, tenure, and promotion for regular tenure track faculty, and also for, that's covered in Article 30 of the collective agreement. The process for adjuncts is covered in Article 32, but there's a lot of references in Article 32 to Article 30, and so 30 and 32 are really to be read in conjunction if you're dealing with adjunct promotion. And then the processes for librarians and archivists are covered in a green document, which we haven't given to everyone because they're not really relevant if you're from an academic unit rather than the library or the archives. But anyone who's from the library or archives should be following along in the green document. And if you need a green document, let us know and Jackie will run and give you one. Okay.
Should we see if there's any questions?
Yes, I will. That's where I'm going to start, actually. I wanted to explain the structure of the tables first, and then I'll go back to start with that question. So I'm on table 4, and I just want to quickly take you across and down the table to talk about what the different columns are. You'll see the left-hand column has a heading topic, and so those are a bunch of different sort of subsections or topics or issues that you deal with kind of in sequence as you go through the process. The second column is headed deadline, and there are 2 types of dates in the second column. Those dates that are in regular upright text with underlining are dates that are specified in the collective agreement as hard deadlines, which should be met unless there's some mitigating circumstance, in which case the parties need to be told of the delay and the reason for it so that we can authorize the missing the deadline. And then the other type of date is written in italic text, and those are not hard deadlines specified in the agreement, but there are dates put in here which are kind of target dates that you might find it useful to meet in order that you will be able to make progress through the process in order to meet the hard deadlines. Okay, so 2 types. Third column is just a checklist to help you keep track of where you are and what you've done. Fourth column and the fifth column are the article references to the collective agreement that are relevant to each of the topics. So that this is sort of a handy table of contents to index to the collective agreement. So that's the structure of all of these tables, and I will in a second move on to talking specifically about table 4, the recommendation processes. But before we go there, what I'd like to do is to pause for a moment and ask how it's going so far. Are there any process issues or uncertainties that you've encountered in the work to date, or questions that you want to ask about the process for the first parts of it? Yeah.
In my department right now, all of the applications are going to be continuing adjunct applications. And I'm wondering about these hard deadlines, because they don't seem to fit in the continuing adjunct timeline. Like, people don't know until their loads are fixed, set for the fall, whether or not they are eligible. So I'm wondering about the hard deadlines.
Right.
Because we're not meeting them, obviously, because we just know the load now. Right.
So I think this process relates to promotion. I think that decision of whether someone will be a continuing adjunct is not really part of what we're talking about here. So, that's not a promotion. It's more of an appointment process that is run by the RTP committee.
Oh, I see. So if a continuing adjunct is applying for assistant, for associate professor.
Well, then this would apply. Yeah, if they are a continuing adjunct and they're applying for promotion, or if they're a term adjunct and they're applying for promotion, then this applies. If it's the process of reviewing an application to become a continuing adjunct, then that's not what we're talking about here. Yeah. Okay. And so they're different. You're right. The deadline, that process isn't spelled out by dates to the same extent as I recollect.
Librarian clinical department, and we do have some QUFA members in our department. How do we select committees, a committee for that process?
There is a provision in the collective agreement for selecting, for putting together committees for QUFA members in clinical departments. So have you read that article in some detail? Because it's not necessarily simply an election there aren't necessarily enough QUFA members in the department to form a committee, for example. And there's also a provision for the applicant having the opportunity to provide input about who are the people who are best qualified to assess the file. And I don't remember exactly what article that is.
30.3
Okay, thank you.
on page 94.
Right. So it talks about the process follows the collective agreement except with respect to the following. The member may suggest the groups, units, or offices that the member regards as most competent to address or assess the file. Those people are not necessarily capital M members, that is to say QUFA members. And then if there's disagreement, that's 30.3.1b, is if there's a disagreement about that, then it gets referred to the JCAA. What I would suggest is that you consult with the Faculty Relations Office, Dan Bradshaw, and so if having read that article you have further questions, if you could talk to Dan, that would be the best thing, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other issues to date? So is everyone pretty much on track? More general nodding, yeah, yes.
I have a question relating to who is allowed to write letters. And right now, the process is such that folks can write letters based on the file if they are from the department or if they are cross-appointed to a department. But what happens if you're not officially cross-appointed, but you work with that person or for interdisciplinary reasons you have a familiarity with that person's work? It doesn't seem that...
So this is writing, the question is writing as a colleague.
Yes.
Right, so the CA is pretty explicit on who are colleagues. You're right, they are department members and they are people who have a tie to the department through a formal appointment, whether it be joint appointment or cross appointment. And so someone like, I think technically someone that, such as you described would not fall into that list of colleagues and should not write under the rubric of colleagues.
What do you write under the rubric of?
You don't.
Well, you can write to the candidate who can put the letter in his or her file.
Well, but at this point, the
That's
candidate's application
That's too late
is
now.
closed, yeah. So, you know, if the candidate had such a letter and the file encountered rocky shoals later on and you know, evidence that spoke to one of the issues that had been raised was within such a letter, I suppose the candidate could be able to enter it into the process later. But the provision for the candidate adding things later in the process after they've put the application in is limited, and those things should only be allowed in if they are, and the words are, if they are sufficiently significant as to alter the outcome, right? So, okay. Any other questions? Okay, so let us assume then that we are transported forward to November the 15th, and the files in your departments are all ready for the committee to look at. Let me just go back over one little distinction of nomenclature that I use. I talk about the application file and the RTP file, and I may use those two phrases as we go along, so let me just explain what I mean. The application file is that part of the file which the member put together and handed into the department in August as the formal application. So it has the CV and the teaching dossier and other materials like that, copies of publications perhaps. So that's the application file. It becomes part of what we're referring to as the RTP file. The RTP file is the whole box, application file and all of the other documents that get added to the process as it goes along. So letters from external referees, letters from students, letters from colleagues, material from the official file such as teaching evaluations and that sort of thing. So collectively all of those become the RTP file, and the RTP file grows as the process goes along. But the application file was simply the piece that was put in first by the member. Okay? So, starting on table 4 at the very top line, step 1, which is headed general, two items are use of the file and assessment of teaching effectiveness. And the reference to use of the file, let me just remind myself. So I'm not exactly sure why we called it use of the file, but anyway, the point is that the actual evaluation of the candidate's application is to be based only on what is in the file. And this is just to make the point that members of the committee and so on are not supposed to be constructing arguments or making judgments on the basis of things that are not supported by the actual contents of the file. And then the second line under step 1, assessment of teaching effectiveness, 3014.2 is a kind of cross-reference to Article 29, and Article 29 is an article which is devoted completely to the topic of assessment of teaching, and so the committees should review that article in detail before embarking on this process. Okay, I don't think we need to delve into that. Do you want to add any comments, Phil? Or?
Yeah, if you take a look at Article 29 when you get around to it,
They don't have it here.
yes,
so
I know.
necessarily.
You will find that in terms of the things you're supposed to look at in the assessment of teaching, I believe there are 10 items, only one of which is USAT. And so our expectation is that the committee will attend to all of the teaching dossier and not simply the numerical results of the USAT form.
Right. Okay, so, sorry.
There's a deadline of November 15th for assessment of the file. You're only supposed to look at what's in the file. What about late referee letters?
Well, if the November 15th is specified as a hard deadline, you may run late if sometimes there's a problem of getting enough referees to respond or getting them to respond in a timely way. You could think of this as sort of two conflicting constraints offered by the collective agreement. One says the file shall be ready by November 15th. The other says there must be the exact number of referee letters. So for renewal, it's 3, not 2, not 4, but 3. And likewise for tenure, it's 4, and for full professor, it's 5. So if you don't have 3 for renewal, and the deadline has come to pass, well, you're going to be violating one or other of those. I would think the best thing is to contact the parties and say, we're late, we're waiting for a referee letter, we expect to be back on track, and so you get a kind of a sign off on missing the deadline, but it's more important to have the evidence than be stuck on the timeline. Okay. Okay, so move on to step 2. File ready for committee review November 15th. That's what we were just speaking of. committee members, moving on to the second row, committee members review the RTP file. It says all committee members shall review the file in order to participate in the formulation of the recommendation. So this speaks to the point that if the committee member is going to actually participate in the final decision, they really have to take part in the discussions and thoroughly engage with the file, read all the evidence. Sometimes it's a bit hard to schedule meetings because people are traveling or whatever, but as I said in the June session, you may find it useful to have a meeting that would involve an absent person being present virtually by teleconference or something like that as the discussion goes on. This reviewing the file, I guess, is kind of the crux of the whole workshop today, so we should spend some time on that. And I think the place that the committee should start is obviously making sure that you have the criteria for the respective processes fresh in your mind, and those are set out in Article 30.6. So where they are what they are. There's some element of ambiguity or lack of specificity in them, but that's what they are, and that's what we have to live by. And so committees shouldn't be kind of erecting additional parameters or constraints on or extensions of the criteria. And it would be helpful when writing a recommendation to actually refer in the recommendation to the specific elements of the criteria and the specific wording of the criteria. So, for example, where for the tenure and promotion to associate, it's the criteria speak to the candidate shall be a very good teacher. Well, if you're making a recommendation that the person be granted tenure and promotion, then it would be inconsistent with that recommendation if you were simply to say the file supports the conclusion that the member is a good teacher. I mean, good teacher is not meeting the criteria. The criteria are a very good teacher. And so I just suggest that you read and keep in mind what the exact wording of the criteria are. Of course, for promotion to professor, there's a kind of duality in the criteria, in that there's a combination of criteria for teaching and for research expressed in two different ways, or met in one of two different ways. And if you look on page 96 of the white handout, which is the extract of Article 30, where it speaks to 30.6.6c, the member must either combine scholarly or creative work judged to be distinguished with very good teaching, or continuing high quality scholarly work with exceptional contributions to teaching. And so to meet the criteria, the member has to satisfy one or other of those pairs of standards. Of course, someone could achieve the higher standard in both teaching and research, which is fine. But a committee that's making a recommendation for promotion to professor should make it clear which of those two combinations they think the member meets. Is it distinguished scholarly work and very good teaching, or is it continuing high quality scholarly work and exceptional teaching? So that's what I'm getting at, down to the level of giving due regard to the exact wording in these criteria, slightly vague though they may be in some ways. I'm looking to my right in case anyone wants to add.
No,
Oh, okay.
I would have in previous years, but I've run out of things to say.
Okay. So, we have the file, we have the committee engaging with it, reading it with the criteria in mind and with the equity article in mind and with the article on evaluation of teaching effectiveness in mind, and paying due regard to the specific criteria. And that will lead you to, in your discussion, to in a direction of a recommendation. And remember, the committee's simply making a recommendation. They're not making a final decision. They're making a recommendation that will go in turn to the head if it's a departmentalized faculty, or directly to the dean if it's a non-departmentalized faculty. Before, in the event that the committee thinks that the recommendation may not be a positive one, then that puts you in a situation that we call an emerging negative recommendation. And so in the event that you think you may not be going positive, or that there's a possibility of being negative, then the collective agreement calls for that possibility to be conveyed to the applicant or to the member. And that has to be stated with the reasons. Why is the committee feeling that way, that the case may not meet the criteria, in such a way, in sufficient detail, so that the member can actually respond to the concern. And the member is given 10 working days to submit a response to that emerging negative communication. It's important that the emerging negative letter, which is going to be written in some detail, be structured in a way that is not conveying the idea that it is the final recommendation. So that at this point, the committee has to keep an open mind. They may be tending toward negative, but they cannot have a negative conclusion at that point. They have to wait until the members had a chance to respond. And so the way the letter is worded is important. The letter should make it clear that we have an open mind, and these are our areas of concern, and this is why. And then the member would have a chance to address those. The member, once receiving an emerging negative letter, is entitled to seek advice, and most typically that the person from whom the member will seek advice is the QUFA grievance officer, Phil Goldman. Phil will, I won't put words in his mouth, but he will, if past practice serves as an indicator of future behavior, he will probably review the file together with the member, and then he will write a memo to the member that points out what he views as ways in which the member could address what the committee has written. And that letter from Phil to the member will usually guide the member in the member's writing of his or her memo back to the committee. And the member is also entitled to include Phil's memo with the member's memo when the member gives that to the committee. So you don't be surprised if, in response to a negative recommendation, you get both a memo from the member and attached to it a memo that went from Phil to the member. And you would like to speak to that?
Yeah, I think these are the moments where I think the committee has to develop a bit of a thick skin. I am not an adjudicator. I'm an advocate. And the person I represent is the candidate. And so what I will often do is assess the procedural adequacy of the emerging negative recommendation with a view to pointing out its deficiencies. That's what I do. And in these circumstances, your obligation is to regard any submission from the candidate That includes a memorandum from me, or it could be from another QUFA member, most likely Remni Cooney, as a letter that you must regard as included in the file, requiring response. So it becomes, in a sense, my words become part of the member's words. And anything that's added to the file is part of the file. And it's, you should make an authentic effort to answer those concerns. It's a one situation where people on RTP committees wonder why QUFA is going after them. We're not going after you. We're basically trying to ensure our duty of fair representation for our member is met. And those are the parameters in which we operate. We will make no recommendation on the academic merits of the file, because we have no jurisdiction on the academic merits, and for the most part, I haven't the foggiest idea about the area of research the member undertakes. So my role is strictly a procedural review of the letter. That's why I think it's very important that the emerging negative recommendation provide clearly stated reasons, because too often we find that letters say something like, we found the scholarship deficient. That doesn't help, because that's a conclusion and it's not clearly stated reasons that the member can respond to. Some of the reasons given are appropriate, sometimes the reasons are not appropriate. We don't know sometimes what to make of, well, the candidate doesn't have enough first author articles or sole author. There's nothing in the collective agreement about that, and so what happens is that certain professional expectations filter into it. You're going to have to balance those with the requirements in the collective agreement. And I will often simply try to articulate what the collective agreement says. And so, for example, I'll give you another example, which I think is an important example. If you use proxies for the assessment of the quality of scholarship, proxies like the quality, the standing of the journal in which the person publishes, or the quality of something else, or the number of articles, or the number of citations, all of those are proxies for the quality of scholarship, but they are not an assessment of the scholarship itself. The primary responsibility for the assessment of scholarship is to be undertaken by the external referees. The expectation is the external referees will read the material submitted for evaluation. And the expectation is that we're interested in the quality of the scholarship on the basis of what the experts, assessors say about it. And other measures are distinctly secondary or tertiary. And so be careful that your primary responsibility is to provide a full and fair reading of the material submitted by the referees, not to substitute your own views of those submissions unless there are clear and compelling reasons why those views are not reliable. So that is a very important moment for the committee to attend carefully to the collective agreement.
Right.
John,
So,
just
yeah.
two other comments. One is just to, I think, echo what both of you have said, namely the importance of the emerging negative letter to be as helpful to the member as possible in terms of pointing out where the deficiencies are, so that the member has opportunity to, if you will, shore up the file in response to specific concerns. That's the first thing. And the second thing is just In my 1 year here at Queen's being involved in this process, what I have experienced is when there has been a emerging negative letter to which there's been a response from the member, and attached to that a response to QUFA, particularly to the extent that the response from QUFA gets into procedure and interpretation of collective agreement. It's certainly been my experience that the head of the committee then, because there are in play things that involve collective agreement interpretation issues, has in the past, or at least in my 1 year, then in turn contacted faculty relations for faculty relations and the university's perspective with respect to matters of collective agreement interpretation. So that seems to be part of the landscape as well.
Yeah. That's a good point to mention, that issues of that sort are best taken up, if advice from the university is needed, are best taken up directly with faculty relations, because Dan and his shop are not in the chain of the academic decision making, and so they can comment on the process, but they're not going to be reviewing the actual academic issues, and so there's a kind of separation of the procedural track and the substantive decision making track. If you were to phone up one of the academics like me or Susan Cole, and we may well have a role in the actual assessment of the file at a later stage, and so we shouldn't be involved in sorting out procedural issues early on.
It just struck me that these are fact situations. It is possible that the committee will make a comment where the best response the member has could be a letter from a colleague who's not a colleague, from some other place. So, for example, if the committee says, well, so-and-so hasn't done any of X, and in fact, so-and-so has done X, it is possible, I think, at that point, for that person to solicit from another person that evidence of the fact that he or she has done X. And so it's always fact specific. Now, this rarely happens, but I just wanted to point it out.
Right, and so responding to a negative, sorry, Art, I'll be just a second. Responding to a negative recommendation is one of the points at which in the process at which the member is entitled to add more materials to the file. And so the letter that the member puts in together with Phil's opinion may well have other documents attached too, such as a more detailed description of research, or more evidence on teaching that might amplify the teaching dossier, or whatever, that speak to the point. Art?
I guess what I'm wondering about is if the principal assessment of scholarship is from the external letters, and if the person being considered does not have access to those letters, how does one...
They do.
They do have access
Oh,
to
yeah.
the letters?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because the last stage before the file goes to the committee is that the member is told, okay, the file is now ready, it's about to go to the committee, you have a chance to look at it. So the member should come into the head's office and review the file. The external letters, normally they're signed openly, but the external referees do have the right to request anonymity, in which case the letterhead and signature block would be obscured. But yes, they definitely do have access to those, all of the letters, the student letters, colleague letters, and external referees.
So it is possible, and in fact, in terms of the comments on the use of facts, it is possible, and probably likely, for the committee statement to the member in the case of an emerging negative, to be dealing with facts that are contained in the external member's letters, and the candidate is therefore allowed to address those facts.
Yeah, and I mean, sometimes the committee selectively picks things from the referee letters and portrays the committee's mental state based on a subset of what's in the letters, such as, a referee letter may not be fully positive. It could have some mild criticisms or some solid criticisms, and might also at the same time have some positive statements. If the committee sort of fixates on the negative things and doesn't give due recognition to the positive things, the member could be saying, well, you know, you're not giving a full and fair reading of what's in the file, and that's a legitimate point. Sorry.
Hi, I was just thinking about the referees and their weight. I mean, if the referees happen to disagree, then it seems to me the committee is forced to make its own judgment. And actually, in political studies, we've had the somewhat masochistic practice of dividing up the candidates' works and assigning them to committee members so that we read them originally ourselves. I guess we don't think our field is so compartmentalized that we can't make any judgment at all on a colleague's work, even though it's, so is, at some point, committees may, I'd like to get your comment, at some point committees may be forced to make their own original assessment based on the referees' letters and their own readings,
Well,
or is that not recommended?
I think, yeah, strictly speaking, that's not appropriate. I mean, granted, the committee, if there is a saw-off between two referees, one way to another, or even 3-1, whichever way, positive or negative, the committee's going to have to come up with a recommendation, yeah. So they are going to have to rationalize that contradictory set of evidence and come to a conclusion. But that, it doesn't make them entitled to substitute their own technical expertise for that of the referees.
I should, yeah. There's always a difficulty in the context of a university environment where most academics believe they are experts in everything, and that's a great difficulty. The reason that the collective agreement is structured in the way it is, and it's been structured that way with respect to the this process since its inception, was to overcome a situation that had been experienced in a range of departments where there was, quote unquote, an old boys network, and they would determine whether or not to allow people to share their futures with other people in the department, and on the basis of things which were not generally connected to the quality of their scholarship. Sometimes it had to do with a judgment that, in fact, what they did was not scholarship. This was true in the past with respect to feminist scholarship, because you get people who would say, well, it's interesting, but it's not real scholarship. And so in that situation, we decided to, in a sense, export the determination of the quality of scholarship, take it out of interdepartmental conflicts. And now, for the most part, we haven't had too much difficulty in committees arriving at a recommendation where there has been disagreement amongst experts. Usually, it's rare to find a situation where the experts are split. For the most part, you deal with situations where you will have 4 or 5, and there's usually there may be one outlier in that, and you scratch your head and ask yourself, why does that person differ so much from the others? And ultimately, you're going, just as they're responsible for assessing the quality of scholarship, you're responsible for assessing the quality of the submissions and the quality of the reading. There's, at the end of the day, no matter how you cut it, you have to make a judgment, and just try to base your judgment on what's in the file, and be careful about making your own reading of the scholarship primary.
Just 2 comments on that, just out of my experience. The one of which is there's a tendency for people writing from other universities in response to the request for adjudication, or letters of reference, for them to say whether or not the person would maintain her at their university, which is my understanding, and maybe you just confirm this, that that's irrelevant. In other words, the only thing that matters is this, not what would happen at that person's university. And the second one is that this works not only in cases of old boys clubs, but also in cases of interdisciplinary work.
Right. Right, yeah, to the first point, yeah, the criteria are our criteria, not the criteria at University X or University Y, which may be an august university or perhaps not, but, you know, that's, as you say, not relevant. That's what's in our criteria that matters, and so that's why we, you know, the referee is supposed to be sent a copy of the actual wording of the criteria, if not the whole article, so they know the context. I've probably read, I don't know, something close to 1,000 RTP files in the last 10 years from my history in this position, and there are big differences from field to field in terms of the detail in which referees often engage with the file. In some fields, and perhaps it's some individuals, but I think it's kind of tied to the discipline, the disciplinary norm. Some of them are very brief, and others will go into great detail in terms of delving right into specific works of scholarship that the member has written and published. And so a letter may be 5, 6, 8, even 10 pages long, speaking to the specific points that the person made in the work that they did. So, you know, that may be overkill, but the brief letter that just says, well, I think this person is great, and they would make tenure at my place, is not a very helpful letter. It doesn't help the candidate either, frankly, because it doesn't give any substance to the basis of the recommendation. I think, you know,
We do that every one of these workshops?
I thought that was
Just
recess.
to wake everyone up, yeah, it's coffee time. So I think it's worthwhile bearing that in mind if you are asked to write a referee letter for someone at another place, bear in mind that actually engaging with the file and speaking to the specifics of the person's work and accomplishments is what will be helpful to the process.
Sounds like in summary, we should neither accept nor abdicate the recommendation decision to the referees. We don't want that recommendation, and we don't, we should
Well,
abdicate it to them. They speak on.
Yeah, they're giving a personal
Exactly.
interpretation of the quality of the work,
Yeah.
and then we read what they said about the quality of the work and put it into the hopper of our process to
Exactly.
give it due weight.
There's always no matter what you read, there is always an interpretation nexus that you have to bring to bear. So sometimes the language in our collective agreement does not fit the academic culture of certain referees. So, for example, in promotion to professor, where it talks about distinguished scholarships, it's going to be very difficult to get any academic referee from Britain to use the term distinguished. But you won't find too much difficulty getting American academics to use the term distinguished, and you will almost never get it from the continent. I mean, so so the issue is not necessarily the specific words. You have to provide an interpretation of what the referee is saying.
Right.
You can come to a determination on the basis of what the referee is saying, that the scholarship is distinguished, even though the referee will never use the term distinguished. And you can determine that where a referee uses the term distinguished, actually it's not great. So you have to interpret the whole thing and not focus on particular words.
Right. That an observation I make that will resonate with Art is one of the highest, high praise from a physicist would be someone does good physics, right? Just the word good, does good physics. And so, that's not, if you just read it flat, it's not very good, it's not distinguished, but they mean it as really good. Am I right?
Depends on the person. Lots of letters that say that this person is an outstanding person. So
Yeah, right, that's true.
It really depends on the particular person writing the letter, so
Yeah.
I don't think it's very difficult.
Right.
What you just said.
So,
Evaluation.
I mean, it does, Phil can make the statement he just made, but the flip side is that once the committee starts to actually try to grapple with these nuances of what they think the referee meant in the context of their own background and culture, that provides an opening for the member, and in turn QUFA, to say, well, you're misreading the file. It doesn't say that, it says this, so deal with what it says. Right? So that's a conundrum that we'll never solve, but we've probably just muddied the waters here.
Made it interesting.
Yeah. Right. So, emerging negative, the letter's gone to the member consults Phil or Ramnik, and a letter comes back from them to the member then replies to the committee and may provide additional materials, and all of that stuff goes into the file, and then the committee has to deal with that as well as what was originally in the file in coming up with their final recommendation. And so in line with what Phil was mentioning, it isn't sufficient simply to send the emerging negative letter, get the letter back from the member, and then carry on with basically the same recommendation without having addressed the points that were raised by the member and by Phil. You may not agree with what they said, but the committee has to actually grapple with them and put it on the record that they in fact did consider the points that were raised and came to a different conclusion, and why. So it's not just a matter of, okay, we got the reply, use the same recommendation. Rose.
Quick question. One of the things that we've had difficulty with, or challenges discussing, is not so much tenure, although we're spending, appropriately a significant time on that. It's promotion to full professor. So the question goes like this. The discussion is, if the candidate has not done apparently materially more research since that person was made associate professor, is that irrelevant because the only criteria that need to be met are the ones stipulated in the full professorship clauses? Does that make sense of the question?
Well, I mean, I guess one of the combinations of criteria that I read speaks directly to that. It talks about continuing high quality scholarly work. Well, continuing implies that there's a progression of work, right? It's not something that you stopped doing 6 years ago when you got tenure and have done nothing since. It's continuing high quality. Does that help?
Can I just ask to be explicit? So if a candidate is a mediocre teacher and has not published anything since tenure and associate professorship, it wouldn't meet these criteria?
Well, either mediocre teaching doesn't meet either of the combinations that I read, right? I mean, that talks about very good teaching. So it's distinguished scholarly work and very good teaching, or continuing high quality scholarly work with exceptional teaching. So good teaching doesn't make it on either way, and neither does mediocre. Mediocre, to my mind, is not. Doesn't meet the very good bar, and that's the minimum, provided that the scholarship is excellent. So in answer to the question, I would say no. Okay, so now we're down to the last box on page 8 above step 3. The last box in step 2. Committee makes a recommendation, positive or negative, that's forward to the department head in a departmentalized faculty or the dean in a non-departmentalized faculty. And the letter, the recommendation goes to the faculty member, the applicant, at the same time as it goes to the head or the dean. And so there's another period there where the member gets to review the final recommendation from the committee and put more input into the process before the file is reviewed at the next level. There are 2 target dates there in the departmentalized faculty. The committee is supposed to be at that stage of passing the file on by December 15th. In the non-departmentalized faculties, there's it's a later deadline, January 15th, and the difference is because in the departmentalized faculty, there has to be time for the head to deal with the file. So that, well, while it appears that there's an extra month in the non-departmentalized faculties, of course, that includes the Christmas, New Year break. So there was a hand, yeah.
With respect to the file and student comments, so they're masked when the candidate sees them. When they go to the committee, does the committee then see the unmasked student files, student comments, as well as?
The confidentiality is with respect to the applicant. So the unmasked letters can be seen by the committee confidentially, remembering that
We have a practice of never unmasking them.
well, I mean, if the committee wanted to know who a particular letter was written by, I think they could. It's not generally material, but there's no prohibition against the committee knowing who wrote the student letters. From a process point of view, it's probably cleaner, easier, simpler just to mask them and put the masked letters in the file, and then everyone deals with it. But if someone had a reason to know who wrote a particular letter, that is not prohibited in the CA.
In arts and science, when it gets to the dean level, they want to see the unmasked.
Yeah. Well, from a process point of view, I know at least in arts and science, the practice is that the file that comes up to the next level, to the principal, will have a set of masked letters which is in the file, and then they'll have the unmasked letters in a sealed envelope so that they're there if someone wants to crack the seal and look at them, but the candidate doesn't see them.
That raises an interesting issue which I've actually never thought about, because what happens if the recommendation is based upon knowing the name of someone, and the candidate doesn't know that, and if, for example, it's a student, the candidate may have had conflicts with that particular student. I just think that raises a whole can of worms, and it's better to not just open that up.
Well, the CA doesn't speak to that.
It doesn't speak to it. I just think it's better process.
So not to have them in the file for the renewal for the committee?
I think if it,
Not unmasked.
yeah, I mean, the question is why you want it unmasked, and you can't unmask one letter. You have to unmask them all because it wouldn't make any sense.
Yeah, well, that's, I mean, in the files that I've seen, either they are masked or they are unmasked in the body of the file.
Yeah.
It's not one way, one the other.
Yeah, it's more efficient to mask them, and then you give it, which you have to do anyways,
Yeah.
to give to the candidate.
Right, so they're very upset.
Yeah, and so going on the same evidence is probably the better strategy. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so committee has done its work. The file then goes to the head or the dean and to the member, and the letter goes to the member. Any questions about that part? The next set of stuff that I'm going to say is basically exactly the same, except that the head will be doing it instead of the committee. So if there's questions about the committee stage, let's deal with those. Yeah?
This is back again to the masked and
Yeah.
unmasked letters. So as head, I would receive the originals and then mask them and put the masked ones into the actual file. Then where do I keep the originals?
Well, they would be they need to be put in the file in a sealed envelope when the file comes forward to the principal. So you're going to keep them somewhere, yeah, yeah. Or, another way is to have a copy of the file which is identical to the one the committee's looking at, which is there for the member to review at the appropriate time. You got to make sure that the file copy that the member gets to review has the masked letters and does not have the unmasked letters. That's the key point, because it's easy to slip up and breach the confidentiality. Okay? Okay, so the file then moves on to the head, and so we're dealing with departmentalized faculties here, moves to the head. There's a waiting period of 7 days after the file gets to the head, during which time the member has a chance to digest the contents of the recommendation and provide further comment. So this could be that the committee made a negative recommendation and the member wants to, again, address that point and rebut, and may indeed, once again, consult with QUFA, so that it may generate yet another response and a memo from QUFA. It's not impossible for the member to also want to add something if the member thought that while the recommendation was positive, perhaps it didn't have quite the right nuance, or missed the point that it could have been more positive, or made a misinterpretation of a fact or whatever that they want to set straight. So the member could well use that 7 days to even add something in the case of a positive recommendation. But probably 9 times out of 10, it's in the case of a negative or a negative that the candidate would be putting another letter in at that point. The 7 days, if that is the case, the 7 days may well prove to be insufficient, especially given the time of year in late December. And so it's not uncommon for a request to come to the parties or to the university that says we want to, or Phil saying we would like some more time, can we postpone the next deadline? And we do accommodate that request and agree to an extension of time at that stage. Okay, so let's assume then that the file has gone to the head and the response from the member, if any, has gone to the head, and then the head is cleared to crack the file open and review it. And the head should review it in the same way that the committee did, that is, coming to a recommendation based on the file and only the file, giving a full and fair reading of the entire contents, and giving due regard to the criteria and so on. So everything that I said before. And then writing a recommendation. If there is, once again, if there is an emerging negative, then the same process occurs, that there's an emerging negative letter that goes to the applicant, and the applicant has a chance to consider whatever issues were raised and rebut. So the head has to deal with the file the same way that we described for the committee. The member can respond. The head then makes a final recommendation, and that goes to the dean and to the applicant at the same time. So that was quick. Question?
Just a question, how frequently does a committee make a positive recommendation to the head of the department, and then the head of the department has a negative recommendation? How frequently does that occur?
It happens. It's not, I can't give you a precise percentage of times. It does happen, but not commonly.
Yeah, the other thing happens as well.
Yeah.
Negative.
The committee may go positive or negative, and the head may go positive. Yeah, that happens. It's probably about equally in both directions, I would say, just as a rough estimate. Yeah. So.
My view here is that sometimes there is an inclination on the part of some people in the chain of command, as it were, to make as few waves as possible. So the situation where a head has a view different from that of the committee is a conundrum for the head, because it's more work. And it could be that the head doesn't want to make waves in his or her department. At the end of the day, my view is that everyone has to take the process seriously, and the candidate is entitled to everyone's best judgment. So even though it may create more work, if someone believes that that's the way things should go, say it.
Right. So there's an important step that we haven't mentioned in here, which stems from exactly this circumstance that you just raised, which is when there's a difference between the head and the committee's view, and that's the second box on page 9. Sorry, no, the third box on page 9. Prior to making a recommendation that would differ from that of the committee, the head meets with the committee to discuss his or her concerns. And so that applies in either polarity. It's if the committee was negative and the head positive, then they're differing. There has to be that meeting, and vice versa, if the committee was positive and the head negative. And the head, at that point, it's important to say the head is not trying to persuade the committee of the error of their ways. Rather, the head is really trying to come to a full understanding of what the basis of the committee's view was, to make sure that the head fully understands the committee's argument. So, sometimes I think that meeting gets into a kind of a adversarial or persuasive mind frame, and that's not the point. The point is just to come to a full understanding of the basis of the first recommendation by the committee, so that the head who's making the next recommendation will be fully informed and fully understand it. Okay, yeah.
Is there a process if the committee is split?
There's nothing that says that the committee has to be unified in its conclusion, and I think there is a formal provision for minority opinions or independent opinions. So if a committee can't come to a unanimous recommendation, then one or more members, a subset thereof, can write their own recommendation. They might, in fact, come to the same recommendation, but have a different line of argument, or they might wish to shed more light on something, some element of the consideration than the committee was prepared to do as a whole. So there's a range of possibilities. It's probably an avenue that isn't used as often as it could be. I suspect that more often a committee ends up with one document just because nobody wanted to bother taking the time to write their minority opinion. But that's there as an option.
Yeah,
And at the next level, the head has to grapple with everything the head gets. So
the process is not, strictly speaking, a voting process. It's a reasoning process. And the head is entitled to the range of reasons that were discussed in the committee. And one of the best ways for that to happen is that if there's someone who disagrees with the committee, whether on the reasons or the outcome, it's better that it be there in writing as a dissenting view, for the head to better be in the position to make a good judgment.
okay, sorry, Rose.
Is the role of the chair of the committee to have input into the decision-making or to facilitate the process? Like, is the role of the chair of an RTP committee more procedural or content-based or both?
I think it's both. I mean, the chair is a member of the committee, and the chair's interpretation of the substance of the file matters just as much as every other member's. But the chair is there to facilitate the process and perhaps do the bulk of the writing of the actual report, but the report is going to be seen and bounced off all the other members too before it's finalized. So,
John, the one thing I'd add is with respect to the notion of perhaps a dissenting view, that would certainly be better than one alternative. I can't remember what the recommendation is that we received from a committee last year, but it was neither a definitive for or against. And I think it's fair to say that that was very problematic for the university, for the faculty association, and for the member.
Yeah.
And so that is not contemplated and discouraged.
Right.
We couldn't decide whether the committee had not made up its mind or the committee had no mind to make up.
Right. Every once in a while that we get a committee that harkens back to former times when tenure and promotion were separate decisions, and where it did happen from time to time that a person would be recommended for tenure but deemed not quite ready for promotion to associate professor yet, and so they would recommend positive on one and negative on the other. Well, when there are two decisions, that's feasible. Now it is one decision; it's all or nothing, and so. But we still get committees that kind of argue these two sides of the issue, and it's not consistent with the collective agreement or the Queen's processes at the present time. We also hear an argument that, we're recommending, specifically on tenure, we're recommending that the person be given a couple more years to get their file together. Well, likewise, that process isn't contemplated. There is a hard decision point for tenure. There may well be reasons for postponing the decision, but typically those are, the time to raise that postponement of a decision is not once the application has come in.
I just want to ask for advice about a judgment call that one would have to make potentially in regard to whether or not, so if there were extraordinary contributions in teaching or research, scholarly, or creative activity, 30.6.7, those would compensate for a lesser involvement in the other area or service, providing that there's been a satisfactory level of contribution. Do you have any guidance on how we interpret satisfactory?
It's greater than zero.
Yeah,
Greater than zero constitutes satisfactory?
No, it's just we don't know.
Right.
It just almost never arises. Satisfactory, think about it this way. And this is off the top of my head, but a satisfactory contribution is a contribution which is there, it's measurable, and that it's not a contribution which has been problematic at all. But not knowing an individual case, it's just hard to know what that means.
I mean, there are. I suspect that we've never had a discussion about this explicitly. I suspect that the two parties have possibly, or at least Phil and I probably have different interpretations of when this clause would apply. I would apply this clause to a circumstance where the person's responsibility profile differs from the norm, and that therefore, perhaps their appointment is largely for teaching, and they don't do much research because they're not called upon to do much research, or vice versa, or service. I mean, perhaps they have a clinical or an appointment as director of a clinical laboratory, but they're still a QUFA member, and so they're not doing a lot of teaching because that's not part of their job. And so, but they have done, so there's more accomplishment on the side that they're appointed for. I don't read it as a quality, I don't read extraordinary as a quality thing, but rather as a quantity. But I'm not sure whether that's how you read it.
Well, I think John's position is well meant and wrong. Only because there are two articles which follow, 30.6.8 and 30.6.9, which deal with the situation of the job definition requiring more attention paid to one as the other. That for me is the quantity one. Whereas my reading is that if you read 30.6.7 in the way that John suggests, It would make the following two articles redundant.
By the same token, though, 30.6.7, if you read it your way, is in conflict with, in particular, the full professor criteria, which say there's a minimum standard for teaching and for research, which are both very good. And
Yeah, but it does say notwithstanding. Look,
this is obviously a debate that
Yeah.
will not be resolved here.
Today.
John and I do have conversations on occasion.
Sorry.
Well, John, just to complicate things further, I know we won't resolve it today, given what we've heard. There's the new Article 32.5.2 on continuing adjunct,
Yeah.
which would refer to many of the same concrete cases as 30.6.9, and which tells us to use information data. The Articles 30.6.1 to 30.6.7 shall apply to the same extent in the same way. Continuing adjunct is continuing faculty. And I had a lot of trouble trying to reconcile that with 30.6.9, since that is still part of the CA2.
And just to note that, sorry, Grant, just to note that that article has been modified and the modification is set out in the faculty relations webpage. I don't know if that's in here, Jackie, or is it?
Are you reading
I'm
the MOA?
32.5.2.
Oh, you've got the MOA? Okay,
Yeah,
good.
he has the MOA.
Yes, okay,
Yeah.
sorry, I didn't know that you had that in front of you, Grant. Yeah, okay, thank you.
I mean, on the face, it seems to negate 30.6.9, but of course, I think we have to try and read them so that they both apply.
These will be resolved probably not abstractly, but when you have to confront individual
Right,
cases
yeah.
and deal with the facts on the ground.
Yep. Okay, so where are we? We've skipped quickly through the process at the head because basically it's parallel to what the committee did. So are there any more questions about that? Okay, so the head makes a final recommendation, positive or negative. That goes to the dean and the applicant, and then the process repeats for a third time at the decanal level. There is once again the waiting period. This time it says 10 days that the dean waits before reading the file so that the member has a chance to digest the head's recommendation and add further response if necessary to the file. Then the dean reviews the file, and that's the process of, just as we talked about for the other two, reading the whole file, nothing but the file, and full and fair reading, and so on and so forth. And then there's that will lead again to the possibility of an emerging negative at that stage. And so the process is basically parallel at the dean level as to the previous two.
Is there a different deadline in the January 15th for that last box on page 9?
Sorry. Sorry, on page,
On page 9, the very last box. It says before January 15th, so it says which is the same date by which the head is still making the recommendation.
yeah, that must be wrong. No, yeah, it's March. Or,
Yeah, it's March 1st.
March 1st.
Yeah.
March 1st.
Well, March 1st is when the dean's recommendation goes to the principal.
I think the question
It'll be
is-
a soft deadline, whatever it is, but it's certainly not January 15th.
No, there has to be some time given for the head to meet with the committee. And so that,
It's probably March 1st. Because 2 boxes up, it's before March 1st in the case of the emerging negative and allowing 10 days for a response.
Yeah, it would need to be made in advance of March 1st in order to meet the March 1st deadline that you see on the next page. So as John said, it's certainly not January 15th, and it's probably some soft deadline that the dean needs to set for him or herself in order to facilitate moving the recommendation forward to the principal by March 1st.
Right.
The deadlines are all before January.
Right.
Yes, it looks like we've missed out February.
Yeah.
So the dean can do all the fine things that
That's right.
he or she needs to do.
Right.
Uh,
Okay, sorry about that. Is that noted for
Yeah.
Rose?
Quick question, we've had a situation in which we've, in the past, had a head and a department, and a committee on one side and the dean on the other side. The dean actually never met with the committee. Is the dean supposed to meet just with the head in such an instance, or with the committee and the head?
I think it's just the head. Oh, well, it says committee head. Let me just check the 30, 14, 11. What
Yeah.
does that actually say?
It says both.
Yep.
Committee
Yeah.
and/or.
Yeah,
So,
right, so should have met with whichever one the head was disagreeing with. Possibly both. The head should, or the dean should have met with
Whoever they're
either the
disagreeing
committee or the head, or both, depending on who the dean was disagreeing with.
It was, he or she was disagreeing with both.
Should have met
Yeah,
with
should have met with both then.
Yeah.
Didn't.
Well, okay, we're not going back, but keep in mind for the future. Okay. So, at that point, we've moved the file on to the dean. The process ends up with a dean's recommendation that goes upstairs. And that takes us, once again, before the final decision is made by the principal, the way the collective agreement is written, and again, before the principal reads the file, there's a period for the member to respond to the dean's recommendation. 10 days for that. And then the final decision is made at that level. There is another process for professor promotions, in that there's a committee called the University Promotion Advisory Committee that is made up of 3 deans and 3 full professors, and chaired by in the prior structure, it was chaired by the VP Academic. Susan, has that been sorted out yet? Are we?
It's been discussed that.
Dan, do you know, are we using the wording as it is written
Using the
for
wording
this
as
year?
is.
Yeah, okay. So it's still principal and committee chaired in the provost's office, which reviews full professor files, and so that's one more source of advice that goes to the principal before the final decision. And this all leads us to decisions, final decisions, by April 1st for a renewal, April 15th for tenure, and May 15th for full professor promotion. And rather than a meeting at that stage, if the principal's decision differs from the committee head or dean, the principal has to explain the basis of the difference in writing. And that brings us to the end. Any questions?
Before you leave, I want to say something briefly about writing a recommendation. Sometimes committees are persuaded that a candidate should not receive promotion or tenure, and too often when reviewing the file, they will write that the candidate is deficient in literally everything, including wrongful birth. I mean, it's extraordinary sometimes that the committees will go out, seem to go out of the way to find negative things to say, whereas the act of judging is an act of balancing. No one is terrible in everything. And so it's much better if the recommendation manifest this act of weighing and balancing. And the same thing could be true of very positive recommendations where the person is even greater than sliced bread, which actually ain't so great. But, and so that's important, that the effort be made, because otherwise the concern is that it exhibits a kind of negative disposition to the candidate. It's a kind of overreaching. And so what we're seeking is, we're not concerned primarily about the decision, but how the decision is articulated and how well it reflects the principles of fairness and balancing. And finally, I want to say something about the people on the committee. For the most part, this is a thankless task. You're judging your colleagues. It won't necessarily make you friends, particularly if you have negative views. We understand that, and we appreciate the effort you put in to arriving at these kinds of judgments. If the candidate or myself write something disagreeing with it, it's not personal. It's just part of the process, and we appreciate every effort you put in to reading and reviewing the file. I know it's a lot of work because I used to do it myself.
To that, I would add the comment that, with respect to your first point about the construction of a recommendation that seems to be picking only the negatives. Such a recommendation is much more easily characterized as exhibiting bias, and could potentially thereby end up being given very little weight, or even being ruled out of the process completely. And so if the committee wants its judgment to be taken seriously, it's much better to do the thorough job and assess the file in an even-handed way, and come to the decision that you come to, but with due regard for the positives and the negatives, than just to pick the negatives and try to construct a wholly negative and strongly bolstered case that only looks at part of the evidence. I guess the same could be said on the positive side as well, although it's not so likely to be ruled biased by some of the engaged parties if it's all positive.
Sometimes the recommendations are reflective of the culture of the unit. So some departments are more collegial than others and want to put the best foot forward for the member. Other units are more divisive. We've had some units in the past where we would worry about anyone going through, because almost everyone who went through seemed to have a negative, the committees will have a negative spin on. And so you took, it's reflective of the quality of the unit and the orientation, disposition towards your colleagues. But you still have to be fair. So put aside your personal dislikes and likes and do the best you can.
Okay. Well, if there are no further questions, then I guess we are adjourned, and the gripping video will be available on the website in a couple of weeks.